So something that I think a lot of people who are coming to try to see and understand the Dhamma, there are a few avenues that we can take towards the brahma vihāras. There's kind of the common view that this is a simple practice that anybody can just do. You can just take somebody off the street and say, oh, go sit in your room, think of like a cute kitty cat, and kind of that energy that you feel, that love you feel. If you can direct that to everybody, even your enemies, then you're cultivating the brahma viharas. And there's also, so you can kind of take that avenue of this is easy, anybody can do it. Or you can kind of say these are really esoteric, mystical states. I'm not going to really worry about this at all until, later, once I kind of have gotten all this other stuff out of the way. And almost putting it on a pedestal that's too high. So I guess my question is, what is a practical way of approaching the topic of the Brahma Viharas that is not putting it on a pedestal that's too high, or kind of hopefully kind of pulling it down to say, oh, well, yeah, this is easy. I can do this easily.
Well, the first thing that essentially any discussion should begin with is the point that you don't get the right view, you don't achieve stream entry by doing some practice that then gives you a result. You reach stream entry by understanding how to do any practice that the Buddha taught. Because, as he said, all wholesome things converge in the Four Noble Truths. So you need to have that sense of what the problem is in order to develop these practices that are treatments for the problem. And so that would undercut that sense of like, okay, I'll just do this and then I'll reach that result, because you would be assuming that you're already doing it properly, and that's really the problem. Whereas it should be more of a sense of whether it's Brahma Viharas or anything else. Understanding how to do this is stream entry. Understanding the path to liberation from suffering, understanding right mindfulness, understanding right composure, understanding right effort, understanding wholesome and unwholesome. These things are stream entry. So that should be the goal. Now, why then would what would be the problem with what you said would be the normal way of approaching metta? Like just thinking of it as a fabrication of beautiful, pleasant thoughts.
Well, there's no discernment. You just kind of start with the assumption, I already know what this is. So,
But no discernment of what?
Well, no kind of clarification of your own views. No clarification of kind of what you're bringing to the practice, so to speak. And I mean, if you have faith in what the Buddha says, then what he says is the problem has to do with these things that you're bringing that are not being questioned.
Right. So in that case, what would be the assumption that you would be bringing to the table when you're doing these practices?
I guess I would think that there could be a few different assumptions, or maybe it's different ways of kind of explaining the same thing. But what comes to mind for me is that you think you know what needs to be kind of developed or abandoned. So you think that, the point of metta, for example, is I need to stop being bothered by this, this mouse that's squeaking. Or it needs to stop being unpleasant, for example. So I'm going to cultivate that when I hear this mouse squeaking, or when somebody breaks down my door and steals all my things, I'll just be like, wow, I love you, man.
So what would be, how would you phrase that in terms of why is that not in line with the path, let's say? Because you can say that, but it might not be necessarily obvious to people why that's a problem.
Well, it means you assume feeling is the problem. To give kind of a robotic answer.
Which means?
That you're not seeing craving is the problem.
So, as I just mentioned before, the Four Noble Truths are where all wholesome things converge.
And this is kind of why you can say the right things, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't mean that you've understood it in that kind of direct sense.
Yeah.
Like I can sit here and say, well, that way that, that means you assume that that feeling is the problem, which means you're overlooking craving. But that doesn't mean that when it comes down to it, I am necessarily going to align that idea with what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how can you prepare? So what is the best way to prepare yourself for situations when you do find intense angry mind arising due to circumstances? Like, do you need to wait for it to happen and then recollect these instructions, or
you can, well, the problem with waiting is you kind of assume it doesn't apply to you right now.
Yeah.
So
even right now, when the mind is not angry, not overcome by ill will, and no external circumstances are bothering it particularly, what would the right practice of metta in this case then consist of? Just to challenge the idea that you can only practice this when actually somebody is being angry with you. Oh, and then, right, because that can be a view that people have, like, I need to wait to be in that situation, and then I can apply this instruction that I have received. You just put it on the shelf somewhere and you just take it in. But that's not mind development then. So you're on your own in your kuti, there's not even anyone there. Can you then still practice metta?
I guess there would have to be kind of on some level something that is even if you are content and you say, well, there's nothing that I'm kind of discontented about to practice metta with, so long as you're not free from suffering, there is going to be on some level something that can be taken as discontent. And this might be wrong, I'm not entirely sure, but you in that case, kind of it might be the case that I'm wanting to practice metta, but there's nothing for me to practice it with regard to. It's that kind of frustration, which is a bit more subtle than we're used to kind of being angry about somebody, more coarse things, kind of that can kind of fly under the radar.
But can you just start with that subtle level?
No, not unless you kind of have a habit in place of doing this with regard to the more coarse things.
So what would be the more coarse things that you do practice metta with, even though they're not necessarily other people?
Well, I guess that kind of leads me to say that practice, keeping the precepts could be that is developing metta. Yeah,
well, keeping the precepts with at the same time understanding that like you said, you don't want to just do it with a mindset of discontent. So you want to reach a point where while keeping the precepts, your mind is content. And then that's another confusion that people will think it's only about people. But really, the principle of ill will is just in regard to how you feel. It's just a resistance to how you feel. So other people and situations might act as a trigger for that. But that tendency is there in relation to anything that you feel. And so that's why if you train yourself, for example, to put up with the discomfort of, which is where you have to start. Always the Buddha said you train yourself in these things first, and then you begin these mental cultivation practices. With virtue, there isn't any fundamental difference between that displeasure that you experience when you stop giving in to desires, and the displeasure that you feel when somebody upsets you, or something like that. It's exactly, if you train yourself in regard to one, you'll be training yourself in regard to the other. So that's why if somebody is, you can actually tell, like just practice those 8 precepts or something for 6 months, and you'll see, even if you haven't made like great effort to develop wisdom, you will see that you'll be more difficult to make you angry than it was before. And so, because another issue with this view of just fabricating these like corny thoughts as a practice, is that you don't realize actually the reason why you have ill will. Like, would you be able to have ill will or get angry or get annoyed if you don't have attachments?
Mm-hmm.
That's why, like, you can be doing all of this, spending 8 hours a day practicing metta, but throughout your day, you keep shoving fuel into that fire of desire. The liability to ill will is being fed, because, like, okay, I have all these possessions, I have all these, friends, family, pleasures that I depend on, and as soon as anybody or anything brings those things under threat, I will be liable immediately. The ill will be there.
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually the root of ill will. So, I mean, they're like two sides of the same coin. So that's why even if you never make effort to practice metta, but you free yourself from any dependence on any pleasure, any attachment, you will have a mind of metta.
Yeah, because there would be less or nothing at all for you to defend. Basically.
Yeah, and then you might not necessarily see, because then if you confuse that metta with like the specific positive thinking or whatever, then you might not see that actually that's a byproduct of the mind of metta. That's not even, it's not even necessarily what defines it. Like something doesn't need to be smoking in order to be hot. So it's more of a side effect.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's then you might see somebody who is, for example, an arahant, like free from suffering, like the Buddha himself actually, and you see in the suttas like he never smiled, and that would be something that, people would confuse metta with that attitude of like being super kind of externally with that overly friendly behavior, and that's not what it is, because he himself, who he said he has the highest metta, the highest compassion, the highest equanimity of all beings, and yet, I mean, you even read how he would sometimes rebuke and admonish monks and things like that.
Yeah.
That shows that it's actually a byproduct of having cultivated a mind of metta. So all those thoughts that you see, for example, in the Metta Sutta, like may all beings be happy, may they be free from illness, may they be free from enmity and not have conflict with each other and whatnot. Those thoughts would arise by themselves for somebody who has freed themselves from that liability to ill will. So in other words, if you heat up the thing, it's going to start smoking, but you don't like try to create the smoke directly. Or another example would be, how some people like that, there's this idea that you fake it till you make it. So for example, you might see somebody who has a very confident demeanor, like a millionaire or something, who goes around, with a very proud and confident expression, and then just try to copy his mannerisms without actually having all the things that give him that confidence. And then that's going to be like a facade. It's gonna crack easily.
It's hollow, basically.
It's hollow. Whereas if you actually develop yourself to gain those things that brought him that confidence, you will have it truly, and you will not need to even think about faking it. Like sometimes, like you wouldn't even think about how I move my hands or what I do. It's just, it would be a natural byproduct.
Yeah, and what is it according to the Dhamma that brings confidence?
The right view. Knowing what you knowing what to do, essentially.
Yeah, no bodhisattvas are confident, but also there's another factor which is described as that which makes people confident even before the right view.
Honesty? Authenticity?
More specifically. Yeah, it says virtue is that which brings confidence. Somebody is virtuous and then they make an offering even to great beings. They will do so respectfully, confidently, because they have already, to some degree, that sense of blamelessness. They are not divided against themselves because they have cleared all that up on account of their virtue.
Yeah, and that's how you would actually get to it, like by really, so to speak, getting your hands dirty and not acting out of anger in those situations that incite anger, whether through body, speech, or even eventually mind. That's how you would reach that confidence that no, like, it's not that the ill will arises because of this sort of quick moment that I didn't catch and I didn't start the practice soon enough and it got out of hand. You would realize that that's on account of your own choices this was happening. And that builds confidence because now you know that will not come back by itself.
Yeah.
It's like you open the door and it comes in. And you were doubtful and not confident before because you didn't see that gateway where, the ill will, you were allowing it in. And so that's why the whole point is you need to then not see this pleasure that comes up when people annoy you, when people do things that you don't like. You need to see that as what your practice happens in relation to. In other words, the displeasure is not the problem. That's the whole point of the Four Noble Truths. Feeling is not the issue. Craving is the issue. And craving is most acutely reflected by your actions. So you start from, you will not be able to purify your mental actions until you purify your bodily actions. But that's how you would see that principle. Like, okay, I cannot do anything about the way this person makes me feel, but I certainly have 100% say on my actions, on what I do. And eventually you would see that on the mental level, it's the same principle. It's not that the mental part happens suddenly. And like I said, then at some point, if you really develop that and you get to the root of it, which is that aversion towards that displeasure, you work on that level instead of how do I make this pleasure go away so that I have peace, kind of like covering up the liability. Then you would even the thing would switch, and then you would start having these genuine thoughts of wishing goodwill, but as a byproduct of the mental state that you have cultivated.
Yeah, so you're not standing in front of the mirror repeating certain thoughts, may all beings this or that.
And when it says like then you spread, as this would define, you pervade the whole world, the first quarter, second quarter, north, south, east, west, with that attitude, it's exactly when you have already developed it, when your mind has that strength to be able to put up with any displeasure that comes up without drifting into ill will. Then you can start finding points or aspects of your experience of your life where maybe you would be liable to this ill will, and by recollecting that same attitude in that direction, or bringing that attitude in that same direction, you pervade.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. So it might be helpful to draw a parallel here between the practice of sense restraint and what we're now talking in terms of the brahma vihāra, right? When you're on your own in your kuti, there might not be anything sensual going on. You're in the forest, there's no people there, and so on. But that doesn't mean that you've abandoned sensuality. Then the question is, am I still liable when I find myself in certain situations to resort back to sensuality? That's the whole practice of contemplating the danger in sensuality. Now it seems to me it's exactly the same with these brahma vihāras. There might not be other people, but you are contemplating the danger of acting out of ill will.
Yeah.
That's
because you have a choice.
Yeah, that's just parallel. It's exactly the same attitude, and this is best developed when you are alone with your own mind, because as you just described, fundamentally it is your relationship to your own mind, so to speak.
Yeah. And the Buddha even said, you would be able to practice these things when you are already able to put up with agreeable and disagreeable things without your mind being perturbed. Because it's on that basis that you cultivate metta. It's on the basis of, okay, I still have that kind of, my mind would go into ill will if I let it. But I have developed myself through virtue and restraint to the point where, okay, the possibility is there, but I don't choose it. Only when you have reached that point and you don't need to be antidoting things and thinking the opposite and putting a veil over the problem so as to feel better temporarily, when you can actually, as the Buddha even said, his mind is not overcome by arisen unwholesome states. That's in Guttara Nikaya 863. And then he says, then he can practice metta.
So would you say that's actually how you fake it until you make it? Kind of taking the stance of, like, in my experience, I mean, unless you're doing something blatantly unwholesome like breaking a precept at that point, but otherwise kind of starting with the, like, there's nothing in my experience that is kind of qualitatively different from that of an arahant. So you kind of fake it in that internal sense of, like, well, if there's this kind of arisen pressure or unpleasant feeling, kind of acting in such a way that it's not acting as if it's not.
But how do you know that in your experience there's nothing different from arahants?
Well, isn't that kind of the principle of, like, if you think there's something you need to get rid of or kind of find, then you're overlooking kind of the work that can be done, which is the attitude towards what is.
In other words, a feeling, you could look at it from the point of view that a feeling is a feeling, and then the problem will always come from your attitude towards it. And again, that's something you can have that idea, but unless you're a Sotapanna yet, that distinction between feeling and the attitude towards it has not been clarified enough. That's where the work lies. And so then only then would you be able to develop through any of these practices. You would take that same principle, because whether it's metta, whether it's asubha, whether it's anything else that the Buddha taught, it's the same principle of feeling is there, and you see that that's not the problem, but you see that you have that option to have a certain context, a certain attitude, a certain disposition or way of relating to it, and then you clearly see that distinction, and then you can just do one of these practices, and that will establish you in non-craving. But as you said, it's you can start from that point of view of saying, okay, I'm not doing anything unwholesome. I'm restraining myself. So now the point here is not like, how do I make this go away in that assumed sense of antidoting and replacing. It's more like, how do I learn not to be moved by this? And that's when eventually you could get to that genuine mind of that's incapable of giving rise to the will. Because the Buddha in fact said, if somebody thinks, I have developed metta, but my mind is still taken by ill will, he should be told, don't misrepresent Buddha, because he wouldn't say that. And people might not realize that no matter how proficient you become at this practice of trying to think the opposite and fabricating nice thoughts, even if you're 99.99999% sure that it's going to work, it still requires chance, because you're basically like, you don't see the mind, you don't understand how this works, you just kind of do it and it happens to work. statistically speaking, but you don't see exactly for yourself what is the ill will. You just took that instruction of, like you said, visualize this, visualize that, and yes, it works, but you don't see what ill will is, which means there will be times and situations where it's going to get out of hand eventually. It's going to have to happen. And you will be liable to ill will. But if you have understood what metta is, it's not a matter of chance anymore. It's not a matter of I just do this and sometimes it works. You see exactly what ill will is, and you see that it cannot happen by accident.
Well, when it's fully developed, you don't even need to do anything anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
The mind is incapable of falling back onto these previous unwholesome states.
Yeah, so then that's when you would have that certainty of, not like I became so proficient at this and I developed the skill of metta. It's like, no, this thing will not come back.
Yeah,
Even if I
exactly.
just relax for the rest of my life, it will not come back. And that's a huge distinction, because if you're not honest with yourself, you might overlook that still your success depends on kind of like circumstantially you pressing these buttons and it happens to work.
And I think it's like just what I get from what you say is that just like switching like kind of our attitude when we come to the suttas. I can read the sentence like, oh, may all being be free from enmity, and say, oh yeah, I know what does it mean, and I kind of repeat that sentence over and over again. But like what you kind of invite us to do more, it will be like to take like, may all beings be free from enmity. Did I actually understand what enmity means in that sentence? Because like I cannot wish to someone something that I don't understand. It's kind of a bit silly. Like,
yeah, you that's another thing. You could have these flowery thoughts of them, wishing for people to not experience unpleasant situations, because you still for yourself confuse unpleasant situations with suffering. So you might have like, that's when like the engaged metta or whatever then becomes like practice of, I need to protect people from go out of my way to protect people from experiencing unpleasant circumstances. It's not bad in itself, but if you confuse that with, I'm helping them prevent suffering, that's like you confuse the fact that even for yourself, unpleasant feeling is not suffering. So the only way that actually you can diminish people's suffering is by teaching them that unpleasant feeling is not suffering. In other words, teaching them the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah.
If they want to understand.
Yeah, that's the whole principle of the Kalyana Metta, right? Metta is the same root as the metta. Like a good friend is not somebody, as you just described, who protects you from uncertain circumstances and so on, but who actually shows how you can become independent in the midst of adversity, independent of that you know how to not suffer in the midst of suffering, basically.
And that view can kind of justify a lot of blatantly unwholesome things in the name of protection.
Well, delighting in company, which the Buddha said, if you delight in company, you actually won't be able to get the right view. He said that explicitly, because you won't be able to understand the signs of your own mind, and somebody who doesn't see the signs of their own mind, as it said, as I wrote about it in that essay, it's like that's exactly how you would be able to see what craving is, what ill will is, for example, by recognizing, no, it's that mental kind of background choice I make when this feeling is present, that is the ill will. And then whether I tell myself that, this person is actually not so bad, he's doing this because his upbringing was very difficult or something, and he experienced trouble as a child, all of that is secondary, to the point of like if you find out that actually that's not true, he didn't have a bad upbringing, he's just a total moron, because the Buddha said there are foolish people in the world. There are people who are beyond repair. He said that. And then like your metta doesn't work anymore if it depends on convincing yourself that the person is good. But no, it doesn't matter how blatantly foolish somebody is, and like the Buddha said, they're literally sawing your limbs off. You still wouldn't have that internal attitude of wishing them harm. Doesn't mean you would just sit there and allow them to kill you, but you wouldn't be like wishing to take revenge or something like that.
Yeah, so the usual psychologizing, finding reasons why other people behave in a certain way, right? Which often then, going back into the past and so on. none of that has got anything to do with the actual practice of metta whatsoever.
Yeah, that's just
that whole domain is just like
it's finding roundabout ways to make this feeling not be what it is.
Yeah.
Because you think that's what the problem is.
Yeah.
And you don't see that the way you, again, craving in regard to the way you feel is what the problem is.
Yeah, and I just like listening to you, I was just like thinking that this whole practice is actually kind of based also to not take responsibility for our judgment. Oh, I should not judge, everyone is good, I wish them well, everyone, like, may all of them be happy and things like that, so that I don't judge them. So I don't judge if I don't judge others, I start to not judge myself, and I feel not responsible for like kind of my action and my kind of craving in regard to kind of my feeling and things like that. It feels like this kind of practice is just based upon like the kind of assumptions like judgment is a kind of
bad thing.
The bad things, but like judgment is not optional. So it's
like, and the Buddha said the second enlightenment factor is judgment, Dhamma vicaya, but judgment of wholesome and unwholesome. So and he also said you should be able to tell a fool from a wise person.
I was just going to say you cannot fundamentally not judge. That's another thing, but that would be more philosophical.
And then another thing, like having metta towards yourself. People would think like, I shouldn't be too restrained, or I should like take it easy, not go too hard in the practice.
The middle way. Yeah.
But see, that's again confusing. Like, I shouldn't put myself through unpleasant situations because I think that's what suffering is. But if you had metta for yourself, you would see, no, actually, what's in my best interest is to understand that this displeasure that I'm experiencing on account of this practice is not the problem. And what's in my best interest is to actually restrain myself and tame this mind so that it won't be liable to not just like extending this principle of this displeasure. And I see that it's exactly this which causes all the problems, not only for myself, but for other people. Like when other people do something to you and you get angry and you end up acting out, again, it's not because of them. It's because of the way you are feeling right now, which is the same as the way you are feeling when you're being restrained and it's difficult. It's that same internal resistance you have towards your own mind is what gets you to act out of those things. So if you cannot tolerate that pressure of sense restraint, of virtue, of celibacy, it's impossible that you'll be able to tolerate every circumstance of somebody making you angry and making you upset. Because another thing is that, we are quite proliferated nowadays in terms of how much we can prevent people from doing things that we don't like. Like, there's all these laws and rules and things that people now don't do things not because internally they are virtuous, but because the government will punish them if they do them.
It's much more difficult to get away with things.
So back in the day, people might be doing things that nowadays they might go to prison for. And because of that, people don't experience. A lot of the time, you can go throughout your life experiencing only very minor upsets. And then for you, it might feel like a huge deal, but in like the wide scope of things, it's actually very minor. And then for you, like you're dealing with these management practices of fabricating good thoughts and stuff, it's going to work. But like, dealing with, I don't know, extremely unfair circumstances. Like actually this mother of this young man in the suttas who was taken prisoner and killed unfairly by the king. And that's the sort of thing that would happen in those days. And she was an anagami, in other words, she had developed that mind of metta. And it said throughout that whole process that she saw her son being taken away and imprisoned and killed, she didn't, like, her mind didn't move. She was not perturbed. And now, like...
Yeah, but if you were to say that now out loud, you end up in a psychiatric ward.
Yeah, and now imagine, like, I don't think unless you're extremely self-dishonest, I don't think somebody who even the most successful person with these metta management sort of fabrication techniques of imagine as you said, like the cute cat or something in your head and extend that attitude, that's not going to work when your son gets killed.
No.
So, but if you have developed yourself in virtue and all that, you can see that's already much closer to that direction of being not liable to ill will anymore.
And what you were saying about the kind of blaming this on others a little bit earlier, that's something that's amplified by solitude. Because if you're annoyed at people and say you're kind of stuck with those people for, say you're on like a long train, and like these people are annoying you, like unless you're really developed already, like so long as they're kind of right there, you're going to be kind of blaming them for it. But say something happens, you're annoyed with somebody, and then you're alone in your room for the rest of the day, and that's still kind of, that becomes more obvious. Like, okay,
it's me
it's
doing
me.
this. Yeah,
like
yeah.
I've been alone for 12 hours, and here I am still kind of like,
It's not obvious, and that's why like this solitude and stuff. It's not like one evening I do it. No, it's a training for a prolonged period of time, and then you're kind of putting yourself in the situation where you will be able to discern it if you try. And then that's exactly why it says you won't be able to see your signs of your mind. In other words, those internal choices you're making, you won't be able to see that unless you train yourself in solitude. So, and obviously as well, you need to be alone to practice metta. As you said, you cannot be like I mentioned before, engaging with people, trying to practice like loving actions and kind actions and stuff, helping people, and expecting to practice metta, because that's not what it's about. Like it might make you feel good, but again, it would be in that temporary management sense, and you're not actually discerning these intentions of the will that you're liable to externally. And you also want to look at it in a certain way where, like, okay, what I think metta is, I've been developing it towards this person in these external ways of either through actions, like helping them out, and again, not that that's bad, but the wrong view is thinking that that is where the practice happens. Helping them out and using super gentle, kind speech, and with my mind as well, thinking these loving thoughts. And now, if somebody comes and harms that person, would I have a will towards the person who, like, is that actually increasing my liability to be angry with the person who does something to them?
Yeah, because you might have inadvertently been building up attachments.
Yeah, exactly. So you're building up selectiveness, and that's quite the opposite of the mind of metta, which is, as the description says, boundless, unlimited, and it's not fixed upon anything.
Yeah.
So it's that's why it's closer actually to equanimity, which is why it would naturally culminate in equanimity, which is the fourth brahma vihara, which is the highest.
Yeah.
Whereas I think most people would have that background assumption that one's kind of like not as good because it's kind of cold and harsh to be equanimous. But no, the Buddha is actually saying this is the best one. This is the best of all. So metta would naturally culminate in that because it's already closer to that than your normal state of like random person just having nice thoughts. It would take you beyond sensuality as well, because it's as I said before, it's that same attitude of resisting displeasure. Well, that same displeasure that you get, for example, when you don't give your senses what they want, that is the same annoyance and discomfort in its nature that you experience when people do bad things to you. So if you overcome one liability, that aversion towards your own feelings, you will overcome sensuality as well. And the opposite applies. If you have no attachments, if you have no desires, if you have no pleasures that you depend on, you cannot hate anyone, because there's nothing for you. There's nothing that you own that could be compromised.
I think there's even this one sutta in the Majjhima where it says that sensuality is really the origin of all hatred and ill will. And then it goes step by step, and then it says all the way to the point of taking up
taking up sticks
and fighting and right. So in our times that's war, and so that's fascinating. Like so if you, like, even from a social perspective, if you don't want to have war in a country or in a certain region, that's never going to become established as long as people there do not see the value in restraint. So if you have a society that tends towards the hedonistic side of the spectrum, that values comfort and instant sensual
An
gratification,
accumulation.
yeah, that is just sowing the seeds for future conflict. And so that is also a way of seeing the danger in sensuality. And it's important, it seems to me, to not think like black and white, like, right, so peace is not the absence of war. It's also not like that. This is why the Buddha often talks about, or this is why we talk about liability to things. So you cannot just say something doesn't seem to be happening externally, therefore I'm at peace. No, because circumstances change and then the whole thing still explodes.
He talked about this with the 5 lower fetters in Majjhima 64. He mentioned, like, somebody might think that the 5 lower fetters is just these specific manifestations of these things. And then he said, well, if that's the case, then a newborn baby is free from these things, because he doesn't know what identity or personality view is. He doesn't know what virtue and duty is. He doesn't know what doubt is. He doesn't even know what sensual pleasures are, or what beings are. So how could he have ill will towards them?
Yeah, that's right.
And he said, but no, it's the underlying tendency, which would be on the level of that feeling. Like when he feels displeasure, his mind pulls back from it. When he feels pleasure, his mind inclines towards it, and that is the basis for everything.
Yeah.
And that's where that liability is. So, if you really want to start seeing it on that general level, not thinking that, like, I need to develop myself in relation to when this situation happens and this situation happens, and it's kind of like this, almost like a cognitive. What's it called? Cognitive behavioral therapy or something like that. No, it's the fundamental nature of feeling. That's the root of everything. Your attitude towards that.
Yeah. So can we then also say that when somebody is practicing sense restraint properly, they are already indirectly moving towards brahma vihāras?
Yeah.
It's not that we're now talking about something separate that you do on the side. No, it's that same principle.
Yeah.
So that's because sometimes, as you said in the beginning, like there might be sort of mystical, esoteric ideas, brahma vihāras, this and that, and then might become a bit lofty and not the right ideas. But you can just ground yourself in precisely understanding one's relationship to feeling, and just understand the virtue and the sense restraint. And whether you like it or not, you will factually, as you said, be less liable to act out of ill will, because you begin to see that in your own experience. So you will be moving in that direction. It cannot not go there.
The same with jhana, when the Buddha said, if somebody practices basically any wholesome thing that's rooted in that discernment of craving, even for a finger snap, it says he's not empty, he's not devoid of jhana. So even if you're not aiming towards that, the point is the mind is being tamed, and that's what is the root of all these wholesome states. That's why he compared it to this like a bowl that when you fill it with water, whichever direction you tilt it, it can go in that like the water will flow in that direction. So you fill that bowl up, which is the gradual training, the sense restraint, virtue, not acting out of these unwholesome intentions, and then whether you tilt it in the direction of brahma vihāras, jhanas, immaterial attainments, kasinas, whatever takes your fancy, it will go in that direction, because all of it revolves around that principle of feeling and craving. If it doesn't revolve around that, then it's not part of the Buddha's teaching, and he wouldn't have mentioned it. That's why he said he teaches only one thing: suffering and freedom from suffering, which is abandoning of craving.